Hello and welcome back to part 2 of working with apps and requests inside of Wized. In this video, we're going to pick up exactly where we left off from part 1 with a form set up in Webflow and a Wized project set up to capture the data from this form and send it to an AI text completion tool. We're using Groq. That's up and running. If we run our request by clicking generate story, if you've been following along, we're successfully sending that data off and getting a response back. So let's keep working on this. We'll get our spinner displaying while the request is requesting, and we'll get the text that comes back from the API displaying on the page. And as you're following along, if you're finding this content useful in learning to build web applications with Wized and Webflow, please do leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel and comment below with any ideas you have for future videos or feedback on these current ones. So to finish this off, let's set up our loader to show while it's requesting, and let's find where our message is inside here and display it on the page. Because we hid those elements below here, we will not see them in the X-ray, but we can access them from our elements panel. So for a quick overview of this, this is all the elements that have Wized attributes that are on this page. We can see other pages here. It'll show us the number of times that element appears. If there are any events set up, we will see the lightning icon. If there's any settings, we will see the settings icon. So we want to go into our spinner, and all we need here is to control the visibility. We want to render it or show it if the request is running. And let's try doing it through the data editor or the data store. Groq create story is requesting. And now it's giving me false. So now if we refresh the canvas and generate a story, we will see that displaying just while the story is generated. This is a quick story, so it's not there for long. If we up this for 1,000 characters or 1,000 tokens, it should take a little longer. Maybe not. But anyways, that is our visibility. Only show when the request is requesting. Last but not least, we have our actual story content. So we'll go back over to elements and go for our result wrapper. And for testing purposes, if we just want to see this on the page while we're working on it, we can just type true and that will be there permanently. Or we could type false and it'll be there, it'll be gone permanently for as long as it says return false. What we want to do is we want to check that 1, it's already returned, so that it's happened once, and that 2, it's not actively requesting. I don't want this to be visible while the user is generating a new story. So we have r.groq generate story dot has requested. For these kind of logic operators, we can use and, using the 2 and% signs, or we can use these pipes or bars or upright lines for the or statement. So if I say r.groq generate story dot is requesting, this means it will show if the request has requested or if it is requesting. That doesn't work for me. That would mean that if this is requesting and it's never requested before, it's going to show that text down there, which I don't want because it appears when we've run our story. So I want to say it has requested and it isn't requesting. The way we do that is we just invert this. So this is going to return true or false based on is this requesting. So what we can do is we can put an exclamation mark in front of that. This says we want it to not be requesting, or put another way, when we check if it is requesting, we want it to say false. So we're kind of inverting that. We're switching it up. Again, if we take that out, it's going to check that it has requested and that it is requesting. We want it to have requested. We want that to evaluate to true, but we want this to evaluate to false. It's not requesting. So we can put an exclamation mark in front of that and close it off with the semicolon. Lastly, the text. We want to click into the text. We don't need to worry about the visibility of this because the wrapper that we just set up the visibility for, that is this div here. It holds the title and the text. The visibility is being handled for the div that it's in. So all we need to do for this is go over to the settings panel on the right and text type. We have the option for HTML or Markdown. If we were using an API that returned HTML or Markdown, plain text is fine for us. Then for the value, all we need to do is find the story that our AI request came back with and display it here. So let's go up to the data editor and into requests and into Groq create story. So these items we've looked at is requesting, has requested. Headers are metadata, meta information that is always returned with a response, but the majority of the time it contains stuff that we just don't need and don't need to worry about. So if it looks scary, that's because it is. I don't understand what a lot of that is, but a lot of this development work and learning involves knowing what you do need to know about and what you don't. Headers, we don't need to know about. We want the data. Now, this is going to return a lot of data about the request, a lot of which we don't need. So we just need to find the text. And when you're working with new APIs, there's always going to be an exploratory phase where you're learning about it, you're studying it, and where you look at this and think, where's the content? Where's the text that I asked the AI to send me? We just need to look through this and find where it is. And it is here. It's inside choices, message, content. So all we want to do is click in after the return statement and click that. And now if we return it, we're going to see our text. So very quick lesson here on accessing items inside an array. Let's cut that out. So let's say we have a variable, an array that equals A. Do the classic ABC, and we do return array. This is going to return the full array. We can also return individual items by telling the code the position of the item that we want to access. In JavaScript and many other programming languages, the numbering for that position actually starts at 0. So A is at position 0, B is at 1, C is at 2. To access them, we do our square brackets with a number inside. So if we put in 0 and return it, it returns A. If we put in 1, it returns B, so on and so forth. What is happening here is, if we put back in our old code, a handy way of debugging tools like this or responses like this is just take out some of the content and see what it comes back with. So if we return our choices, we can see that we have an array with an object inside it, and there are a couple of key value pairs. So if you can wrap your head around this, that's a huge amount of learning on how objects and arrays and different data types work in JavaScript. So we have an array, which is used for holding lists. In this case, it's only holding one thing. It's holding an object with these key value pairs. So to access the item inside of choices, we need to access the item at the first position, which is this object, which we just do by typing square bracket with 0 inside. If we run that, now we can see our object. What we want is we want message, and then we want content. And we do that using this dot notation by doing dot message dot content. And there we have it. There is our text. So if we close out of this, and if we Then just check that that's set up correctly. Plain text, story. Yeah. And then refresh the canvas. We should now be up and running. And by the way, I just spotted that my result text doesn't have a setting, even though I just applied it. I realize now I set this text setting on the wrapper and not on the text itself. I'm not going to cut out this mistake because I don't want to give the impression that all development is perfect and goes smoothly every time. Part of becoming a good low-code developer is dealing with these problems. So I am simply going to copy this, or cut it rather, and I'm going to go over to my text where I actually have this already. Anyway, so let's just double check. The text has text type plain text. It's going to return the story, and the wrapper is set to display when the request has requested and the story is not actively requesting. So let's refresh the canvas, enter our story, crank up the temperature, enter our max number of tokens. And what we should see is the spinner should appear and it should then disappear when the request finishes, and our title and text with the AI generated story should appear. And that's it, folks. We have a pretty unusual story here, riddled with grammatical and spelling errors. But anyways, that is our AI story generator up and running. That was a lot of new information that just came at you. The good news is, if you can get your head around this stuff, this covers a wide amount of functionality and actions and things that you might want to build inside a web application. Working with APIs, sending requests to them, getting data back, and making changes on your Webflow site with what you get back is the core of most of what you're going to be building with web applications using Wized and Webflow. Everything is built on these blocks: apps, requests, events, elements, and everything in the data store, the variables, the secrets. All of those work together to build varying complexity in web applications. So anything you build that is more complicated than this is going to use these same core tools and principles. There's just going to be more of them, and they're going to be more complex, and they're going to interact with each other in different ways. So let's review. What we started off with was a page in Webflow that has a form. The form, at a minimum for this project, needs to have a text input or text area for a story to go into. We also added a select field for randomness or temperature, how random the response is. This has human readable text, and it then has number values that the API needs. We also have a number input for the max number of tokens, or how long the response can be. This form has a submit button. Each input has a unique name. And lastly, to pick up all of this in Wized, we have an attribute on the form. So when you drag in your form element in Webflow, the form itself that we need to put the attribute on is this second div just underneath those 3 lines. And I just gave that a attribute that always starts with Wized and is storygen_form. Next, I just have 2 sections. I have a div that has its own unique Wized attribute, and it has Wized cloak to keep it hidden. And this just has text that stays the same, and it has some HTML and CSS for that little spinner. And we set this up to only show when the request is happening. Then at the end, we have a div that has our title, which does not change, and the paragraph text where the result of our story will go. So this wrapper has its own Wized attribute, and it has Wized cloak so that it's hidden initially, and we can control its visibility. And lastly, we have our paragraph element, which also has its own Wized attribute. That's everything we need on the Webflow side. We then went over to Groq into their console.groq.com. We created an API key, which we stored in the data store of Wized as a secret, which is how we protect confidential or secure information, because everything else that goes in here is ultimately stored in the user's browser. We then went to their documentation, into the API reference, and learned a little bit of the basics of API requests, HTTP request types, post, get, delete, and curl. So remember, if you're on documentation in the future and it's all in JavaScript or Python or some language you don't recognize, look for that drop down, go to curl. Curl is your friend. And the request body told us what optional parameters we can use, the temperature and the tokens. We then broke down this curl. We took the start of the API request and we created an app called Groq. We took the second half of the API request and we made a request in Wized that uses Groq as our app. The method is post, which it told us here in the documentation. And the second half of the API or URL endpoint goes in here, return, inside quotes for a string, chat/completions. Credentials we didn't touch on because you almost never need that and it stays the same. Touch on that in another lesson. We then need to pass in headers and body. Over in the curl, the header items start with a capital H. Content type just tells the API the way we're formatting the request. And the authorization was where we entered in our API key for the request. Then under the lowercase d, that denotes or sets out what needs to be in the body. We created a key of model and the value is this AI model name. We can see that here. Model for the key and the value is returning a string with the model name. For messages, we saw that this is further broken down into role and content. For that, we created an item, messages as the key, and for the value, we returned an array, the yellow brackets, that had one object in it, the curly purple brackets, with role user, which tells the AI that this is a user, an end user, a human interacting with it. And the content comes from the story prompt input, the input with the name story prompt in our form that has the attribute storygen_form. Lastly, we added in the temperature, which came from our select input and the value that we set. But we saw that even though it looks like we entered a number in Webflow, so if we go over to Webflow, into the select, into one of these options, we have the value. This gets sent as a string. If we go back into item, value, and run this, this was appearing inside quotes, which makes it a string. To turn it into a number, we put it inside this function in JavaScript, number with a capital N inside two brackets, and that turns it into a number. And lastly, the max tokens, we didn't need to change into a number because the number input in Webflow returned a number automatically. So with the request set up, we went to our form element and we created an action where on the submit event, the default behavior, submitting a Webflow form, is disabled. The action we go for is to perform request Groq create story. For the spinner, we just set up the visibility, render if, and we entered the check for if that request is currently requesting. So it'll only show when it's requesting. For the results wrapper, we set this to only render if the request is requesting, or sorry, if the request has requested and if is requesting equals false, meaning it's not actively requesting. We learned that we have the two and% signs to make a conditional check be and. We want this to be true, this first part, and we want this second part to be true. If we want to check or, either this has to be true or that has to be true, we just enter the two pipe icons, the upright bars. But we want and for this. Again, for this kind of logic, ChatGPT is a great help. Lastly, the text on the page. It's just a paragraph element that has a Wized attribute, and we have gone into text and we have set the value to return this, which is the part of the request that has the content. So we learned that we had to correctly access that array at position 0 and then get the message and then get the content. And that changes the text on our page to match the response that comes back from the AI. So that's it for this tutorial. I encourage you to play around with this. Go back over to this documentation and find something else, some other parameter that you can use here that you can work into your setup. Maybe you go for model and find a list of the models that they have, put that into a select, and let people select the model that they want to use. Figure out how to add a new key value pair to the body to send that information along. Play around, the world's your oyster here. Do anything that is going to enhance your understanding of API calls and requests. Up next, we are going to look at CRUD, C-R-U-D, and that stands for create, update, read, and delete. So what we're going to do is we're going to store the responses that we're getting from the AI tool in Airtable, and we're going to pull a list of those into the application, render them as a list to display them on the page. That's up next. As always, please like and subscribe. Leave a comment with any feedback you have on this video or for future tutorials you'd like to see. You can also head over to our Discord channel in the link and use that to ask questions too, and to chat about Wized and building applications with Wized with other users of the software. That's all for now. See you there.